And good afternoon. You're listening to Ken Hudnall. This is the Ken Hudnall Show. Coming to you from our studios right here in exciting El Paso, Texas. Gateway to the Old West and the most haunted city in the country. Well, today is June the 22nd, 173rd day of the year. Only 192 days remain till the year's over with, and we'll start a new one. Key observances and holidays. It's National Kissing Day, actually popularized in the UK. National Onion Ring Day. That's a popular food observance in the US. World Rainforest Day. An Anti-Fascist Struggle Day. That's a national public holiday in Croatia, don't you know? And in 1870, on this date, the U.S. Department of Justice is officially created by Congress. 1940, France signed an armistice with Nazi Germany during World War II. And in 1941, Germany launched Operation Barbarossa, invaded the Soviet Union along an 1,800-mile front. And a holiday or a date that veterans should remember. 1944, on this date, President Franklin D. Roosevelt signed the GI Bill. Well, let's see what stories we have in the news, because there's always something going on. President Trump delivered a stark warning to Iran over a key oil route. He said, "I'll blow the feces out of them." Vice President Vance, Iranian officials arrive in Switzerland to begin a new round of talks amid the current ceasefire. Vance joined White House envoys Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner to launch a new round of negotiations. Swiss officials said Sunday the talks between the U.S. and Iran are expected to take place during the course of the morning. Leaders of Pakistan and Qatar are there as mediators. And President Trump, Iranian President Masoud Pezeshkian, on Wednesday signed a 14-point memorandum aimed at ending the war between the U.S. and Iran, if it does any good. Well, President Trump said the UK's Starmer will resign. Wishes him well amid reports of the Prime Minister's political future, or lack thereof. He said Keir Starmer will resign as Prime Minister of the UK. He felt badly on two very important subjects, immigration and energy, and I wish him well. President Trump made that declaration in a True Social post. And that's a breaking story that's going to continue to be followed by the major media in every country, I'm sure. One MMA fighter helps nab a Florida University student leader in a suspected child predator sting. Mixed martial arts fighter with a passion for identifying possible child predators has been credited with exposing another suspect in South Florida. Dustin Lampros, founder of 561 Predator Catchers, used a decoy posing online as a 13-year-old boy, according to a court report filed by Delray Police, or Delray Beach Police, I guess I should say. He seeks to identify suspected child predators by engaging them in online conversations with people posing as children. He and his associates surprised the targets of their stings at public meeting places and filmed the confrontations and called the police and hand them over. In May, Christian Walden, 21, of Boynton Beach, Florida, allegedly expected to meet up with a 13-year-old named Justin at a Home Depot for his sexual rendezvous, according to Palm Beach County court records. Instead, between potted furs and pallets of pavers, Lampros strode up, and the father fighter pounded Walden unrelentingly while questioning him about his plans. Well, certainly that's an interesting way for a proposed tryst to end. Well, a Golden State Killer investigator finds red flags in Marilyn Monroe's death scene decades later. As the world celebrates Marilyn Monroe's 100th birthday, Paul Holes is revisiting one of the most scrutinized celebrity cases in Hollywood history. Retired cold case investigator, spent more than 2 decades solving crimes in California and playing a pivotal role in identifying the Golden State Killer. Now he's applying his expertise to the movie star's 1962 death and TMZ celebrity crime scene Marilyn Monroe, which premieres on Fox. Using artificial intelligence to create Monroe's home, the special follows Hull senior crime scene analyst Alina Burrows and true crime reporter Kiki Monique has examined the questions and theories that have surrounded Monroe's death for more than 60 years. According to what Hull told Fox News, I was aware of how she died, a drug overdose, ruled a probable suicide, but I didn't know many details till I started digging into this case. I think a lot of the questions about her death really come down to how poorly her death scene was documented and processed by investigating authorities back in 1962. Left a lot of questions unanswered that could have been answered if they'd done things properly. In August of 62, Monroe was found dead, lying nude in her bed with a telephone receiver dangling from her hand. Near the bed, police said they found an empty bottle that contained about 50 Nembutal capsules. That's a powerful description sedative used to treat insomnia. No note was found. The first red flag, of course, according to Halls, was the lack of documentation. Very few photos of the death scene, but even more, even with the one photograph that does exist showing her dead in her own bed, Halls said his eyes, based on his experience and expertise, picked out inconsistencies, such as the sheets being clean and perfect. She's arranged on the bed in such a way it doesn't look like an overdose. A pill bottle on his tiny little nightstand next to her head were all perfectly arranged, all the labels facing in the right direction, including the most notable pill bottle, the one that contained the Nembutal. Well, it'd be interesting to find out if, in fact, she was murdered or if she did commit suicide. Well, a U.S. Olympian named David Hearn has denied vandalizing the reflecting pool after his arrest went viral. He was an Olympic canoeist, been accused of vandalizing the iconic reflecting pool in Washington, D.C. He's 67 years old, represented the U.S. in 3 Summer Olympics, denied the accusation that he vandalized the newly refurbished Lincoln Memorial reflecting pool. He said that after he was arrested by the U.S. Park Police on Saturday. He told the Associated Press he only reached into the pool because he wanted to examine the peeling new coating. Only briefly touched a chunk of what was still attached to the side of the pool and let go shortly after park warden told him to. Hearn told the outlet he's a curious citizen. Reached down to see what it felt like. It was very rubbery. Now he has a date to appear in court next month. Previously arrested by the U.S. Park Police nearly 30 years ago and ended up beating the charges. Well, we'll see what comes of this particular arrest. Well, an overlooked red state quietly built one of America's most competitive tax systems. Texas and Florida usually come to mind when Americans think about tax-friendly states. But another deep red enclave has quietly joined that club, North Dakota. Tax cuts, strong finances, and billions in oil revenue contributed to create one of the nation's most competitive tax environments, where other states grapple with budget shortfalls and debates over tax hikes. The issues likely remain front and center for governors and state lawmakers as they look to attract residents and businesses and investment in the years ahead. That's amid a growing affordability crisis in the U.S. Most states don't sit atop one of the nation's largest oil formations like North Dakota does. But tax experts say the broader lesson to take from that state's applicable almost anywhere. Strong revenues can lower tax burdens and strengthen state finances rather than fuel spending increases. And the payoff for North Dakota has been straightforward. Residents keep more of what they earn, businesses face fewer tax burdens, and the government remains on a solid financial footing. Well, one thing that we have seen in most of the non-red states, when in doubt, the Democratic leaders raise taxes. That's their answer to every single question. Well, Victor David Hansen dissects how critics completely misread the Iran deal. He called out critics in a newly signed U.S.-Iran preliminary agreement, arguing they misreading American leverage in negotiations. Speaking on Jesse Watters' Primetime, Hansen disputed what he described as misconceptions about the deal and said the military conflict dismantled Iran's infrastructure, leaving Tehran with absolutely no cards to play. He said they've suffered probably $500 billion to their nuclear military industrial complex. It took them 50 years to build, Hansen said in a response to what he called an unhinged argument that Iran is better off now than before the war. Trump administration memorandum of understanding, or the MOU as it's called, with Iran was released this week, laying out the terms of the deal reached by both parties for a 60-day ceasefire and a framework for negotiations. Well, the deal itself has drawn criticism from both sides of the political aisle. Critics arguing it doesn't include aspects like an immediate dismantling of Iran's nuclear infrastructure or the removal of enriched uranium stockpiles. Hansen also pushed back against critics who cited difficulties in moving oil out of that region due to Iranian actions in the Strait of Hormuz. Well, you also have to be aware of the fact that the left's response to anything President Trump touches is to oppose it, no matter how solid it might be. Well, the Obama Center visitors say project symbolic of black excellence claims scandal-free legacy while President Trump ripped it. Opening weekend visitors at Barack Obama Presidential Center called the 44th president's legacy an example of unifying, scandal-free black excellence, while they were reminded of what they saw as a dark turn for the U.S. under President Trump. Lillian Tillman, who lives about 40 minutes outside of Chicago, told Fox News Digital the community is great. We're just kind of glad it's here. We need something like this. Chicago looks like a certain place to contain certain people who are not from the area. So I just think this brought everybody together. It's something for the community, for black people on Juneteenth, so I thought it was just great. Well, the Presidential Center's opening weekend began with a star-studded private ceremony and a concert on Thursday night. The 19.3-acre campus opened to the public on Friday during the Juneteenth holiday, which celebrates the day black slaves were declared free in 1865. Well, keep in mind, President Obama was elected primarily because he was God's gift to the world, because he was, quite frankly, a minority. And he has continued to wear that cloak since the time he served in office. Well, a Christian police officer in the UK was suspended for asking questions during about Islam during the DEI training, and he just won a settlement. Former UK police officer said he was suspended and forced out of policing after he asked questions about Islam during a DEI workplace training. Has reached a confidential settlement with the New Yorkshire police after he alleged discrimination against his Christian beliefs. Luke Salmons, a former community support officer, said the force went through a series of DEI training courses in 2023 and 2024 intended to develop a new policy on race and religion and culture. And the courses were hosted by external trainers and presented as a safe place where officers could ask challenging questions. However, what actually happened if you questioned anything to do with Islam, you were marked as a troublemaker. Well, Kamala Harris says hope should be a verb as viral podcast clip draws word salad mockery. Former Vice President Kamala Harris offered podcast host Don Lemon her own definition of the word hope on Friday, resulting in a clip that has since gone viral on social media as a word salad response. Harris said, I really, truly believe this. We each have light inside of us. We need to know that that's what inspires our hope as much as anything external to ourselves. Former Vice President and 2026 presidential candidate continued her long-winded response, imploring Americans not to lose sight of their vision of the future when faced with political or personal loss. Well, you know, Harris is somebody who's had everything handed to her throughout her political career. The only thing she didn't get handed to her was the presidency. And that's because I believe she approached it the wrong way. Well, responders put an explosive blaze at a fireworks stand in Oklahoma. The Broken Arrow Fire Department in Oklahoma reported that firefighters quenched a blaze at a fireworks stand on Saturday night. The department noted in a Facebook post there were fireworks detonating when they arrived. At about 8:50 p.m. Saturday evening, Broken Arrow Fire Department was called out for a fire near East Kenosha Street and South 236th East Avenue. Upon arrival, Engine number 4 arrived to find a fireworks stand on fire with fireworks actively detonating. As other crews arrived, A-shift firefighters were able to quickly control the scene and extinguish the fire in about 20 minutes. There were no reported injuries. Fire occurred 2 weeks ahead of July 4th. Many Americans have celebrated Independence Day by setting off fireworks or watching fireworks displays. And I might suggest that you keep an eye on your pets because the fireworks tend to panic them. Well, 17-year-old Major League Baseball prospect swipes 8 bases in a minor league game. The Los Angeles Angels have a speed demon in their farm system, and he's just getting started. Juan Cespedes, only 17, already a record holder. Playing for the Angels Dominican Summer League team, he swiped 8 bases, the most stolen bases ever recorded by a minor league player in a single game since at least 2005, according to Major League Baseball, MLB.com. Billy Hamilton stole 7 bases in a Major League game for the Philadelphia Phillies in 1894. Cespedes started the game with a walk and was able to steal second, third, and home in his second plate appearance. He reached base on a throwing error. Stole second, couldn't make it past there. Stole second and third 2 more times while reaching base 2 more times later in the game. Replaced in the top of the 7th inning by Yelinson Betances. Cespedes said the outfield plays the outfield for the rookie-level Angels team. Joined the Angels as an international free agent for the Dominican Republic. Reportedly agreed to deal with the team during the 2025 and 26 international signing period and got a $300,000 bonus. He's appeared in 13 games for the Angels. He's hitting .395 with a OPS and .975. He's stolen 25 bases and 56 plate appearances and only been caught stealing twice. Landman star Michelle Randolph stuns with a barely there metallic yellow bikini in a new summer photo dump. She's soaking up the summer sun in a new bikini photo. 28-year-old actress shared a series of photos showcasing what she's been up to so far in June. Literally the most perfect person ever, according to one fan in the comment section. Another added stop, "You're so queen," in a third writing. Well, a lot of, even though the series itself has been criticized heavily, it still seems to be a winner. Where viral hurdler Kennedy Smith pops up at the World Cup. Gabriela Moura in her summer uniform and meat on the grill. I'm talking about Sunday screen caps, where the best reliever in the game gets to take the mound and keep himself in shape for those calls to the bullpen. There's a relief appearance coming up at the end of the week and into much of next week. Former Texas A&M hurdler Kennedy Smith, a attractive young lady, went viral several years ago, months after her competition. Her ability to find the camera on the track turned her into a social media star. The love of the camera has helped her in her career away from the track. Since calling it a career in hurdling, she's been seen on the sidelines covering the UFL and is now a professional fighter league reporter. She's also a Houston Texans host, and these have opened doors up for an opportunity she never dreamed of, putting her on the bucket list, covering the World Cup as a host. She's been in Houston for the World Cup festivities and hadn't lost a step when it comes to being in front of the camera. Well, some folks have it all. James Burrows, legendary Hollywood director behind Cheers and Friends and Will and Grace, dies at age 85. Died Friday. Burrows' family confirmed the actor's death in a statement to People magazine. The Associated Press reported saying they're celebrating the extraordinary life and enduring legacy of the director who passed away peacefully on Friday, surrounded by his family. More than 50 years, Burrows is one of the most influential and beloved directors in television history, according to the statement. As a legendary director, mentor, and creative force, he helped shape generations of comedy and brought immeasurable joy to audiences around the world. And they also discussed his unparalleled career. Directed over 1,000 episodes of TV and was instrumental in creating some of the most iconic series ever produced. He's also referred to as the king of the multicam sitcom. Had his big break in the industry when he directed episodes of Mary Tyler Moore Show, which led him to becoming one of the principal directors of Taxi, which earned him his first two Emmy Awards. Went on to co-create the hit sitcom Cheers and directed all but 35 of the 275 episodes of the show. Work on that show got him 6 Emmy Awards throughout its run. Well, let's see. Plans for racial reparations are facing setbacks in Illinois and California. And the fact that California may oppose it is absolutely mind-blowing, because they have been in favor of anything that favors the minorities. America says its favorite fast food chain has been named. McDonald's wins hearts, but not the best burger, according to the survey. A new report exploring how restaurants are performing in the U.S., which brands America's diners prefer, found that McDonald's comes to mind first when most consumers consider eating fast food, even though a number of other chains ranked higher for burger quality. In its survey, Best Bites 2026 U.S. Restaurant Brand Rankings, the international market research group YouGov sought to discover which restaurant brands comes out on top among American adults. The group surveyed U.S. adults about restaurant considerations, food quality, and dining preference. One of the most interesting findings is that McDonald's leads all fast food brands in consideration when Americans are deciding where to purchase fast food, despite ranking behind several competitors on best tasting burgers. Well, I remember when I discovered McDonald's almost 60 years ago. It was fascinating to listen to all the reports. Well, a black bear attacks a teenager and charges a group of hikers on a trail in Washington State. The Mount Si, S-I, which is located less than an hour away from Seattle, is the most popular hike in Washington State. Sees about 100,000 visitors a year, except in the Cascade Mountains. The teenage boy was injured after a black bear had lunged at a group of people hiking on a trail in Washington State. Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife said they were called the Mount Si Trail at the Natural Resources Conservation Area on Tuesday afternoon. 3 hikers are about 2.7 miles up the trail when a black bear charged at the group and swiped one of the hikers. Young boy received scratches, taken to the hospital for treatment. Second group of hikers told authorities they're being followed closely by a black bear for several miles. Another group said they saw a second smaller bear while they were exiting the trail, according to the Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife. Well, on that note, we've been talking about conspiracy theories. And there's a number of conspiracy theories that absolutely still come to mind. For example, it's long been a question, was John Wilkes Booth actually killed in the barn at Garrett's farm? There's a lot of evidence to support that after murdering President Lincoln, most famous assassin in American history, lived for 40 more years. Now, according to the story, in 1865, on Friday night at Ford's Theater, John Wilkes Booth shot President Lincoln with a single bullet to the back of the head. Instantly became America's most wanted man. He jumped from the presidential balcony, broke his leg in the process, fled on horseback across Maryland and Virginia, and shot 12 days later at Garrett's farm near Port Royal, Virginia. Now, that's the story that history reports. But some folks believe Booth didn't die that night, and they claim he was actually acting on behalf of the Confederate Secret Service who aided him in his escape. And there's a lot of folks who believe the man killed at Garrett's barn was actually a look-alike, a patsy used to throw off Union soldiers. And even more amazing, that's just one of 3 theories about Booth's escape. If there's even the slightest possibility John Wilkes Booth was able to escape the law and live as a fugitive for 40 years, they should be examined. No question about it. Now, the assassination took place on Good Friday, April 14th, 1865, less than a week after Robert E. Lee surrendered to Grant at Appomattox, Virginia. President Ms. Lincoln made plans to attend the play Our American Cousin, starring Laura Keene, at the Ford's Theater in Washington, D.C. Now, John Wilkes Booth, at the time, was 26 years old. Handsome, well-known stage actor. A lot of folks referred to him as the Brad Pitt of his day. Made his own plans for the theater that night. Now, Booth had a dark side that other folks weren't aware of. He was an obsessed, fanatical supporter of the Confederate cause. That was outlined in a letter that Booth left for his brother-in-law. When he learned that President Ms. Lincoln would be attending a performance by renowned actress Laura Keene in the popular comedy Our American Cousins in Ford's Theater in Washington, he decided it was time to exact revenge for the Union victory by assassinating Lincoln. Well, Ford's Theater was the perfect place for Booth to stage his final performance. As a famous actor, he was friends with the owner, been in the theater's inaugural play, even got his mail delivered there, and he knew that place inside and out. It was his home turf, so to speak. On the night he shot Lincoln, he didn't even try to conceal his identity. Walked in the front door while the performance was still in progress, said hello to people that recognized him, made his way to the hallway outside the president's private box. Now, presidential security in those days was nothing like what you see today. Lincoln generally traveled with 1 or maybe 2 guards. And conveniently, this night, the man who was supposed to be guarding the door to the box wasn't even there. He left the theater to go get a drink with some friends at a nearby watering hole. So Booth peered through the peephole in the door, which it was said he drilled earlier that day. Said that saw there was no guard inside the president's box, just Lincoln, his wife, and another couple. And Booth, it was said, had memorized the play. Waited till the big laugh line, don't know the manner of good society, eh? Well, I guess I know enough to turn you inside out, old gal, you sockdologizing old man-trap. Well, if Will Ferrell delivered that line today, you'd hear crickets, but in 1865, it brought down the house. When that big joke hit and everybody laughed, Booth opened the unlocked door, walked up behind the president, and shot him. His deed done, he stabbed a military officer, tried to stop him as he jumped from the box to the stage, which was 11 feet below. He landed hard, got up and delivered the last line ever speak on stage. He said, "Sic semper tyrannis," Latin phrase making clear Booth's sentiments. Thus always to tyrants. Well, chaos erupted throughout the theater. A lot of folks say Booth broke his leg when he landed on the stage. And operating on pure adrenaline, he ran out the stage door, mounted his waiting horse, and galloped off into the night. According to history, 2 weeks later, Booth was surrounded in a Virginia barn and killed by Union troops. But for decades, though, his family members have offered a different version of events. Joanne Holm, a distant relative of John Wilkes Booth, claimed when she was a little girl, her mother told her the truth about how Booth died. Her mother said, "They're going to say he died in a barn." He didn't die in that barn. He lived for many, many years afterwards. And Booth, along with David Hurl, a confidant and fellow Confederate sympathizer, fled on horseback through Maryland into Virginia. He covered 14 miles in a matter of 2 hours. Paused to collect previously hidden weapons and supplies from the Surratt house, a tavern in Clinton, Maryland. Booth never got off his horse and probably wasn't there more than 5 minutes. Did have enough time to boast he just killed the President of the United States. And why wouldn't he, despite the football? Booth thought he was a hero. Believed he'd done the Confederacy a favor. Well, Harold and Booth raced from Surratt and headed south another 14 miles to Waldorf, Maryland. This time it took him 4 hours instead of 2. And the pain from Booth's broken leg had to be giving him serious issues, or forced to stop at the home of Dr. Samuel Mudd. Dr. Mudd set the leg. Here that some say Booth took the first steps toward assuming a brand new identity. shaved off his mustache, and even colored his hair, according to some reports. He was officially on the run. Well, Booth and Harold left Dr. Mudd's in the morning. The manhunt for Booth, of course, was in full swing. Already had a $100,000 price on his head. So Booth and Harold spent several days trekking through the forest and the swamp, making their way south to friendlier territory. And on April 24th, they arrived at Garrett's farm near Port Royal, Virginia. Well, according to history, the belief has always been that Booth was killed in Garrett's barn 2 nights later by Union soldiers. But there are a lot of folks that believe that Booth was never at Garrett's barn, and if he was there, he was only there briefly. A lot of folks believe that 26 Union soldiers had Booth and Harold surrounded in the barn. Harold started freaking out. He wanted to surrender. Booth, of course, is familiar being the center of attention. So Booth kicks Harold out of the barn. Harold emerges, immediately taken into custody. He'll be tried and hung 10 weeks later. And now the soldiers demand that Booth surrender. According to the story, Booth responded no way. And for Booth, this is the performance of a lifetime. He will not leave the center of the stage. One of the soldiers sets fire to the back of the barn in an attempt to flush Booth out. Another Union soldier spots Booth inside the barn and fired a shot, hitting him in the back of the neck. And at that point, Booth is dragged out of the barn. And as he lies dying, Harold asks a Union Army Lieutenant Edward Daugherty, who was the man that was shot in there? Who was he? Daugherty says, well, you know who he was. Harold responded, I don't know who he was. He said his name was Boyd. I didn't know it was Booth. Now, here's what doesn't make sense. Why would Harold, who knew John Booth by sight, say that Booth's name was Boyd? He's been captured, nothing left to gain. And more important, who's Boyd? Is it possible he's some sort of patsy placed there to take the fall for Booth? There's even speculation that the body drug out of Garrett's barn doesn't even look like John Wilkes Booth. Well, Booth researcher Nathan Norlowick maintains that it's impossible the man killed in the barn was John Wilkes Booth. 3 different witnesses said the man in the barn that was killed had reddish hair, even though it's a well-known fact John Wilkes Booth had jet black hair. And Dr. May, Booth's doctor, says the body looked much older than the John Wilkes Booth he knew in life and had freckles. Norlowick believes Booth left Garrett's barn 2 days before the Union Army got there. He thinks it was in everybody's interest for it to be believed that John Wilkes Booth was killed. I mean, let's face it, the reward money offered for Booth's head was over the top. The political pressure to apprehend him was huge. Gotta remember, the country was in complete chaos at this point in time. War was over, but the Confederacy was still alive in spirit. The nation was so unstable, all the pressures on Secretary of War Stanton to bring Lincoln's assassin to justice. That $100,000 price tag on Booth's head today would be worth $1.3 million when adjusted for inflation. With the eyes of the entire nation on him, there's no way to understand the lengths that Stanton may have gone to close this case. And knowing that the nation needed Lincoln's killer brought to justice so it could survive as a united country, there's one important question to be considered. Did Stanton put a Booth look-alike at Garrett's farm? And Norlowick's most compelling pieces of evidence comes from John P. Simonton, who served in the office of Judge Advocate General of the War Department for 43 years. In his statement, Simonton claimed, I studied the evidence in this case and found no definitive proof that John Wilkes Booth was ever captured. Now, the National Archives in Washington, D.C. currently have a service record for Captain James Boyd, a Confederate soldier in the 6th Tennessee Infantry. And he was a Union prisoner of war. Back then, Boyd was directed by Secretary of War Stanton to be transferred to Washington, D.C. Now, why would the Secretary of War be concerned about a Confederate captain? And why would he move him to Washington? Turns out Boyd was actually a spy for the Union. His job was to inform the North about Confederate smuggling operations in Tennessee. And Boyd's paper trail goes cold at a critical time. He disappears from all records after February 15th, 1865, 2 months before Lincoln's assassination. But also in the National Archives is a photograph of James Boyd. When put side by side with a photo of Booth, there's no question the two resemble each other. Except for the hair color, James Boyd's a dead ringer for John Wilkes Booth. So the question becomes, was Boyd summoned to D.C. by Stanton to be the fall guy? Was he inserted into the barn that night undercover so he could become Booth? Well, it's a wild theory to be sure. But remember this, if Stanton's covering this up, it also means Stanton needs a body. And speaking of the body, you need to hear what went down during Booth's autopsy. According to Jan Herman, a naval historian who studied the autopsy records of John Wilkes Booth, Booth's body was brought from Garrett's farm to the USS Montauk, monitor class ironclad ship. There were 13 people present for the autopsy, all connected to the War Department or the Navy Department, including a photographer. Herman claims only one photograph of Booth's body was ever taken, and that negative was handed over to a detective who turned it in to Secretary War Stanton as soon as it was taken. Now, Herman believes that negative has been lost over the decades, maybe intentionally. Even more intriguing, Booth's family was not even allowed to see the body. And even more intriguing than that, there were other apprehended Lincoln assassin conspirators being held prisoner on board the Montauk, but none of them brought up on deck to identify Booth. Prominent District of Columbia surgeon Dr. John Frederick May, who was summoned to identify the body and actually operated on Booth a number of years before, told the assembled witnesses, "This body doesn't look anything like Booth. I don't recall Booth being freckled. I don't recall him being as old as this gentleman." But according to Herman, Dr. May felt pressure to go along with the idea that it was Booth's body. She suggested Dr. May went along with the investigation because he didn't want to be at risk of being implicated in any part of the assassination. So under immense pressure from Stanton, Dr. May signed off that the body was, in fact, that of John Wilkes Booth. But Herman believes these details reveal a very sloppy identification of Booth, one that might not hold up to scrutiny. She also believes there are 3 little letters that could potentially blow this investigation wide open. DNA, don't you know? During Booth's autopsy, the cervical vertebra and a small section of his spinal cord were removed. These pieces of Booth's body are still hanging around someplace. They currently reside in the National Museum of Health and Medicine in Maryland. And Herman believes if you extract the DNA sample of the Booth tissue from the vertebra and the spinal cord and compare it to those samples with DNA taken from a partial examination of Edwin Booth, John's brother, that provide indisputable evidence of whether or not it was actually John Wilkes Booth that was shot and killed at Garrett's barn, April 26, 1865. Nothing could be stronger than an actual DNA comparison, and that's possible today. All that would be necessary is to get permission to test a piece of bone in Maryland compared to the sample of Booth's brother Edwin's body in Massachusetts. And in recent years, Booth and descendants have taken steps to do just that. But they've been blocked by the courts. And until the courts allow that to happen, the question remains unanswered. But why would they possibly deny what would give them the truth? Well, if John Wilkes Booth continued to live, there ought to be evidence about that. And the question becomes, where did he go? One theory is that when Booth realized Jefferson Davis wasn't going to throw a parade for him and he was basically screwed forever, he adopted an alias. Interviewing historians about various theories, there are 2 different aliases that have enough credible evidence surrounding them to investigate: John St. Helen and John B. Wilkes. Now, that gives us 3 possibilities. One is that Booth assumed Boyd's identity, though there are no records of Boyd after Lincoln's assassination. Another theory is that Booth assumed the alias of John B. Wilkes and fled the country. And the final theory is that as a patriot who was willing to kill for his country, Booth possibly stayed in the U.S. and lived out his days in West Texas under the alias of John St. Helen. Well, Chuck Huppert, John Wilkes Booth researcher, believes Booth pulled off a 19th century version of identity theft It says Booth was introduced to an Englishman in Indiana named John B. Wilkes, who was born in Sheffield, England in 1822. Huppert claims Booth stole Wilkes' identity and traveled to India posing as the Englishman. Remained there until he died in 1883. Huppert believes John B. Wilkes actually returned to the U.S. in 1873. There's a photograph of Wilkes, he says, was taken during that visit. And the man in the photo looks identical to John Wilkes Booth. Huppert doubles down on his theory of the will that he says John B. Wilkes wrote in India in 1883, 18 years after Booth's alleged death. And that contains special bequests to people who were friends and family of John Wilkes Booth. $25,000 went to Margarita Rosalie Wilkes, natural heir of my body, according to the bequest. Margarita Rosalie Wilkes is Booth's daughter by his wife, Isola Mills Darcy Booth, who is said to have married John Wilkes Booth in 1859. $25,000 went to Mary Louise Turner, natural heir of my body. Turner's another daughter of Booth, this time by Ella Turner, who at the time of the assassination was John Wilkes Booth's mistress. And there's a bequest to Henry Johnson. $1,000 a year to Henry Johnson, a free Negro to whom I owe my life. Johnson was Booth's personal valet, who later escaped to Harper's Ferry, West Virginia. Well, you can't help but ask, why would John Byron Wilkes be giving money to John Wilkes Booth's wife? And unless it's Booth, there's no actual answers to that. Huppert offers a simple explanation. It wasn't John B. Wilkes who was there writing the will. Well, there is compelling evidence it was actually John Wilkes Booth writing the will as John B. Wilkes. But that theory does fall apart. The will isn't signed. If it was, anybody be able to analyze the handwriting, compare it against other known Booth signatures. Without a signature and any other way to authenticate the will, there's no way to authenticate the photograph of Wilkes. The theory that John Wilkes Booth lived out his years as Englishman John B. Wilkes remains just a theory. And that leaves John St. Helen. Well, M. Turner Chitty is the daughter of the late Dr. Arthur Ben Chitty. Arthur was a historiographer at the University of the South and one of the main proponents of the theory that John Wilkes Booth used John St. Helens as an alias. Well, Dr. Chitty passed away in 2002, and his daughter has now become the family Booth expert. Chitty contends Booth actually arrived in Franklin County, Tennessee in 1872. Fell in love with and married a local girl named Louisa Payne. According to Chitty, when Booth confessed to Louisa, he'd love her forever, and he'd also assassinated the 16th President of the United States. Louisa was unfazed, to say the least. But she became fazed when she found out she had married a man under the wrong name. She freaked out so much she demanded to go back to the courthouse and get remarried using Booth's real name. And according to Chitty, the Franklin County Courthouse marriage register clearly shows John W. Booth's signature on February 24, 1872, 7 years after the assassination. Well, what raised people's eyebrows the most is when a 90-year-old Juanita Keel, a living relative of Louisa Payne, decided it was time to talk. She said, "My grandmother's sister married John Wilkes Booth." They were married before he told her who he really was. Keel went on to say Booth went by the name of John St. Helen until he came clean to Louisa. As newlyweds, Booth and Louisa moved to Memphis, where she grew homesick. Louisa returned home to her family. Booth told her he'd come back, but he never did. Identity of Louisa Payne's husband remained a closely held family secret before Keel decided it was time to come forward. When asked how her family felt being married to the mob, Juanita said it wasn't not something to be talked about outside the family. So why was she willing to talk about it now? Well, at her age, she decided everybody's dead that mattered, and would have been hurt by it, so I decided to talk. Where'd John St. Helens go from Memphis? Mary Bates Webby, granddaughter of Phineas Bates, a lawyer, believes her grandfather was a confidant of John Wilkes Booth in Granbury, Texas. But he was calling himself John St. Helen at the time. According to Webby, Bates received news that St. Helens was dying and sent for him. He wanted to make a deathbed confession. Told Bates how he'd escaped. According to Webby, as he made the confession, her grandfather began to think that no man to make a deathbed confession is serious if he wasn't a real person. And according to Bates, John St. Helens didn't die that day. Actually recovered, left Texas, and settled in Enid, Oklahoma. Assumed a new identity, David George. And that name appears to be in code. Two of Booth's conspirators were David Harold and George E. Adzarad. David E. George. It's either a sly reference to Booth's true identity or just a guy with two first names. It's hard to know which is true. In 1903, Bates saw an obituary indicating a man from Enid, Oklahoma had confessed to being John Wilkes Booth. The body was in a mortuary waiting to be claimed. So what did Bates do? Went to Enid to identify the body, and sure enough, it was his friend, John St. Helen, or John Wilkes Booth. Well, the David E. George part's one of the wildest parts of the story. The man committed suicide by drinking arsenic. Arsenic combined with his embalming fluids mummified his body. So when Phineas Bates arrived to identify the body, they gave him the mummy because nobody else claimed it. Well, now we've got a mummified body that people think is John Wilkes Booth. And second interesting aspect, people are giving away mummies. Over the years, Bates tried to sell it a few times. Actually, offered it to Henry Ford for $1,000. But ultimately, it ended up, like so many mummies, in his garage. When Bates died in 1923, his wife sold it to a traveling circus. Mummy toured the United States for almost 50 years before vanishing in the early 1970s. Well, now we got people paying to see a mummified body they think is John Wilkes Booth. There is evidence that John Wilkes Booth may not have been killed at Garrett's barn, but is that evidence airtight? Can it be proven beyond a shadow of a doubt that Booth was neither John St. Helen or John B. Wilkes? Well, the only way to really know for sure is to exhume Edwin Booth's body and do the DNA testing. Problem is, exhuming a dead body isn't as easy as it used to be. When the Booth family petitioned in 1994 to have Booth's body exhumed and its DNA tested against his brother Edwin's, state attorney in Baltimore originally said it was okay to exhume John Wilkes Booth's remains. Then somebody appealed that decision to the courts, and it went to a judge for a decision. According to the judge, the alleged remains of John Wilkes Booth were buried in an unknown location 126 years ago. And there's evidence that 3 infant siblings were buried on top of Booth's remains. There may be water damage to the Booth burial plot. There are no dental records available for comparison, so identification may be inconclusive. So for these reasons, coupled with the unreliability of the petitioner's less than convincing escape cover-up theory, gives rise to the conclusion there's no compelling reason for the exhumation. Additionally, one of the objections to examining John Wilkes Booth's body was that it had been out of the ground for as long as 6 weeks after exhumation. That's more than 15 years ago. Given today's technology, there's a easier workaround. All we need is a sample from Booth's brother Edwin and access to the bone in the museum in Maryland. DNA test is our best shot at solving the John Wilkes Booth case once and for all. We want to close this chapter in our history. We need to compare the samples that we now know exist with a DNA sample from Booth's brother Edwin. The test is going to show either they're brothers or they're not. Without that, all we have is a great story of a famous actor who jumped off from the stage to legend by pulling off the role of his life, hiding his own identity and hiding from history. So until we can force the hand of the powers that be and test that DNA, we'll never know for sure whether John Wilkes Booth died in 1865 or not. Well, from John Wilkes Booth, let's talk about Confederate gold. Stolen treasure or hidden wealth of a new Confederacy. Well, almost $20 million in gold and silver vanished at the end of the Civil War. In April 1865, Confederate President Jefferson Davis decided to gather the riches of his government and flee to the Deep South, where he hoped to be safe. Over the next 2 months, the rebel gold traveled by trade and wagon across Dixie. Along the way, Davis hid massive amounts of gold and silver in the hopes the Confederacy would one day rise again. Some said the group that he charged with stashing that rebel gold was the Knights of the Golden Circle, the KGC. Secret society that was founded in the 1850s to promote the interests of the South. And the KGC used a code made up of an elaborate system of signs and symbols to mark the hiding spots. Well, to this day, most of that money's still missing. In fact, 150 years ago, it was hidden so well that modern technology still can't find it. So could mysterious carvings and symbols throughout the South be clues to the location of this vanished treasure? And more importantly, who took the Confederate gold? Was it stolen or was it merely hidden? And where is it now? Well, this is one of the greatest mysteries from that tragic period in our nation's history. Now, in 1865, the Civil War was drawing to a close. After 4 terrible, bloody, devastating years, the Confederacy was defeated, but it hadn't yet surrendered. Battle still raged, though Union forces were poised over on Richmond, the Confederate capital and home to the executive mansion that served as the Confederate White House. The remnants of Robert E. Lee's once powerful army, barely 24 miles away at Petersburg, couldn't hold back the Northern forces for long. In church on Sunday morning, April 2nd, Jefferson Davis, President of the Confederacy, was praying for some sort of miracle. But it wasn't to be. Even before the Sunday service was concluded, Davis was informed that Lee's defensive line at Petersburg had failed. The Yankees were within 24 miles of the Confederate capital. Federal troops would be inside the city and limits of Richmond at any point in time, so they had to evacuate. Desperately clinging to hope, Davis prevailed upon Lee to rally his troops for one more heroic stand. He needed enough time for the Confederate government and, crucially, the remains of its treasure to escape the oncoming federal troops. If they could preserve the treasury, maybe the Confederacy wouldn't be dead. Confederate treasury amounted to about $10 million today. Junior bank assets worked out to about $9 million, which means Davis had approximately $19 million. He knew it. Between the gold and silver coins, some gold bullion, and a fair amount of jewelry and precious stones, he had more than enough to finance a new army. At least that was his hope. Still, Davis needed time to turn his hope into a plan, so he asked Lee to give him that time. But Lee couldn't make such a promise. The only thing he could guarantee to Davis was the rest of Sunday to make his escape. 8 o'clock that evening, Lee and what remained of his army would themselves be falling back. Richmond was a lost cause. With the few final hours Davis had left, he arranged for 2 things. 2 trains, though there are stories that say maybe as many as 9, to steam south from the capital. One would carry the president, his cabinet, and other officials. Another would carry the treasury of the Confederacy as well as the assets of 6 Richmond banks. We've now focused on both history and the future. The archives and papers related to the government were evacuated as well. Well, so how much money are we talking about? What was the real value of the Confederate treasury? Well, reports vary, of course, with a few claiming that there was never any real treasure. But according to most sources, the amounts removed from Richmond were substantial, including U.S. silver coins, U.S. gold coins, 200,000 in Mexican silver coins packed into 39 kegs, gold bullion, jewelry, and precious stones. U.S. coins consisted of $327,000 in specie. And because the coins are U.S. currency, the Confederacy did not mint its own coins, keep in mind. The money retained its value, unlike Confederate paper money, which is already nearly worthless. So how much was it worth? Well, best estimates put it at about $19 million in today's currency, more than enough to start a new fight, potentially start another war. Well, that night they missed the 8 o'clock deadline, but by midnight the trains had all left the capital, making the best speed possible on the last of the Confederacy's southbound rail lines. They were heading for Danville, Virginia, just above the North Carolina border. Outside of Danville, one of the trains met with disaster as a boxcar collapsed, causing the engine to derail. 5 soldiers had died in the crash, although only 2 of the bodies were identified. As rescuers sought to salvage what could be removed from the wreckage and transported by wagon train, we find the beginnings of the legend of Confederate gold buried in or near Danville. As a formal meeting of the Confederate cabinet, which to many people makes Danville the last capital of the Confederacy, the president and other officials set out for the deeper South where they'd attempt to hold the government together. Some say Davis already looking westward for a new base of power and resurgence. Wouldn't find it, though. Davis was captured by Union cavalry in Erlinville, Georgia on May 10th. But on April 6th, the treasure, made up of coins and bullion, jewelry, and precious stones, was all set to be moved. On that date, Confederacy had 3 days left to live. Well, the dual journey south took weeks, during which the fate of the Confederacy was sealed. Lee's battered army came to rest in Appomattox, Virginia. northeast of Danville. April 9th, in a comfortable parlor, Ulysses S. Grant and Robert E. Lee signed papers that would bring an end to the Confederacy's most important military force. Opposing general signatures effectively ended hostilities between the North and the South. Interestingly enough, the parlor in which the surrender was signed belonged to a distant relative of mine, and according to the family story, all his furniture disappeared. Souvenir hunters, don't you know? But the war was over. The United Nations was weary of battles and bloodshed. Even as the signing took place, the wealth of the Confederate treasury and the assets of the Richmond banks continued to move deeper south. Plans were being made to put it into hiding. Soon the time would be ripe. With the hidden funds, a new war could be fought. The South could rise again. As for the next dollar amount, we'll never really know for sure, because on April 2nd, at the same time the treasure was being snuck out of Richmond, portions of it began to vanish almost immediately. The first losses, of course, were in Danville. Some say during the aftermath of the train wreck. Others say during the time that a treasure train awaited instructions to move further south. But Danville is far from the last location where the treasure dwindled. In fact, a lot of folks believed that the disappearance is part of a larger deliberate plan. Plan that some say involved burying many separate caches of coins and jewelry throughout the South, along the route taken between Danville and the wagon train's ultimate destination, Washington, Georgia, where Jefferson Davis was waiting on his train to catch up with him. April 6th, just 3 days before the surrender to Appomattox, the treasure began to move south once again. And in course of heading south, the first real accounting of the treasure began. That accounting showed that over $200,000 had already gone missing. Civil historian Mark Waters believed the Mexican silver dollars were removed from the caravan in Danville, although nobody knows for sure whether it was stolen or hidden as part of a larger overall plan. What they did with it and where it went, nobody's been able to decode, if you will. When it comes to what happened, there's one argument favored the gold being hidden rather than stolen. That many Mexican silver dollars would have weighed as much as 5 tons. And that much weight would have required thieves to be as well equipped with wagons and horses as the Confederates themselves. And the Confederates would have known that the weight of Mexican silver dollars would slow them down as well. So it makes sense to separate the Mexican silver dollars from the rest of the treasury. So it's believed to be buried in Danville for later recovery. In fact, that's one of the legends of Danville. Maybe this has been buried in the cemetery. Well, on that note, we've come to the end of today's show. We'll finish talking about the Confederate treasury tomorrow. Until then, this is Ken Hudnall for the Ken Hudnall Show saying have a true great evening.